Underlay is a huge part of embroidery. It provides a foundation for the top stitching, and it can do three things really. It attaches it to the backing, so it stabilizes the area. It can tack down the nap of the material, so it kind of smooths the area out. And then because you're sewing in layers, it can actually build up your stitching. So underlay does kind of three things and different ones to varying degrees. Let's look at the properties of underlay and see which ones are appropriate for your designs. I have some lettering on screen, and I'm going to start with that by selecting it. And then you'll notice that I have access to the underlay on the property bar. I can also right click and go to properties and go to underlay. And that gives me a little more visibility to the properties that apply to the underlay itself. And I can choose from this dropdown what I want. And there's a primary and a secondary. And the only difference is when they sew. Primary sews first, secondary sews second. And you don't have to have both. You can have one or two. And I'm going to go in an order that is not the order in the dropdown, but I'm going to go from least to most aggressive. So I'm going to start with the center walk. I'm going to hit apply. Now you can see that my lettering has a line of stitching going underneath each segment, each little chunk of the letter. So if I play this slowly, you can see that it does a segment at a time. So it underlays a little bit and then top stitches, and then underlays a little bit and then top stitches. For lettering, you have the option of using continuous underlay. And if I do that, it will underlay the entire letter and then top stitch the entire letter. So that's what continuous underlay does. I'm going to turn that back off for now. And let's look at the center walk itself. Center walk is the least amount of underlay I can have while still having some foundational stitching. There are very, very few things that I sew that don't have something underneath of them. It's a part of embroidery. So with a center walk, it is just a line of stitching. There's not a ton there, but it does attach it to the backing. It doesn't really tack down a lot of nap, and it doesn't really build up my stitches that much. There's just not that much stitching there. So what good is it? Well, it's exceptionally good for thin, small elements. I don't have a lot to go over it, but I want something underneath. Center walk is there for me. It starts sewing. It makes sure that I'm tied in well. It gives me that little bit of stability for those little bitty thin elements. It's great for that. So center walk is the least aggressive I can have. And the property for it is the stitch length. So yes, in embroidery, length equals loft. The longer the stitch, the more it stays up out of the fabric. But as I'm dealing with an underlay, the shorter the stitch, the more it pulls down in. It attaches it, it tacks down nap a little bit better when it's shorter. It sucks down into the fabric. Because I'm dealing with thinner elements, I may choose to have a shorter stitch length so that I can get through those elements without the underlay kind of hanging out around a curve. The next option I have to look at is an edge walk. What this does is it goes up one side and then down the other and then satins over it. And with this, you have the option of an absolute margin, so how close to the edge is it, and it stays that distance the whole way through. Or I could change that to a percentage, which if I do that, it is the distance between these is a percentage of the overall stitch line width. For edge walk, I tend to stay with absolute. That absolute margin keeps that edge walk right even with the edge, whereas a percentage, if you have a really wide area, a circular fill, it's going to change very much throughout that form. Edge walk is more aggressive than center walk. It has one on one side, one on the other. It's still not it's still not tacking down a lot of nap. There's not a lot of stitching going down in the middle of my elements, but it's incredibly good for cleaning up the edges of things, especially on textured garments. So it kind of gives, it gives, and I use this example pretty much every time I talk about edge walk, is it gives kind of a fence that the stitches can pull against, and it makes that edge that much sharper. So if I'm doing things on a textured waffle type material or a piqué type material, it's highly likely I'm going to be using an edge walk somewhere in there. Now it may be as a secondary underlay if I'm using, if I'm doing something with a really big design and I've got a big fill, I may use a different primary, but then to clean up that edge, I may go ahead and follow it up with a secondary edge walk. Center walk is good for little bitty elements, 12 to maybe 20-ish points wide. Edge walk is good for that 20 to 40 point wide range. When you get bigger than that, you may want a few more stitches, or if I'm doing something that is going on a little bit more of a textured material or it has a little bit more nap, I may go up to a zigzag. And what a zigzag does is it goes across the form as it goes through over the form. So it actually walks up the middle. So it's kind of half center walk, right? It walks up the middle and then zigzags back over, and you can watch that play out. This is doing it by element because I turned continuous underlay off. So you can see it do each segment. So with zigzag stitching, I've got that center walk going down, it's attaching it to the material. I've got that zigzag coming back over the form. It's crisscrossing over. It's tacking down some nap. I've got multiple layers of stitching. I'm starting to build up my stitches a little bit more. This is good, again, for those more textured materials, ones with a little bit more nap, and honestly a little bit larger in size. If one zigzag is good, two is better. If I go to double zigzag, it will zigzag up the form and then back, crisscrossing over itself before that top stitching. So you can see it's really starting to tack down the nap of the material. It's really starting to build up the stitching because I've got layers of stitching crisscrossing over itself. And so I'm attaching it to the backing, I'm building up my stitches, I'm tacking down the nap, I'm really getting some aggressive underlay here. If I was doing something like a really fluffy towel and I didn't have any water soluble topping available to me because I wasn't thinking about it and I just needed to get it done, I could probably get through it with a double zigzag as my primary and maybe an edge walk as my secondary. That might do it. If I were to do something like that, you can see just how aggressive that underlay is, and that's really going to clean up my lettering. For the next underlay, it's a fill underlay. Turn this one back off. And a fill underlay, it is set at an angle, and this angle you can change. You can change the density, you can change the stitch length, and you can change the border margin. So how close is it? How small are the stitches? How far apart are my stitch lines? And at what angle to the stitch direction line of the element does that fill fall? This typically is used for larger elements and things that are going to cover a much bigger space. If you want to get really aggressive this way, you can even do two fills that crisscross over each other. This is like a double zigzag-ish type of underlay, but now I've got little bitty stitches going down, tacking down the nap, crisscrossing over themselves, and on the edges I almost have an edge walk forming from the edges of the fill. So this kind of lattice work can really provide a foundation. So you've got a lot of options when it comes to underlay, but what if you don't really know? Or what if you have something that is thick and thin? What do you do? Well, just like with auto stitch type and auto density, we have auto underlay for you as well. And that is, again, based on size ranges. So for really thin areas, it's going to be a center walk. For a little bit bigger, it's an edge walk. It sounds a little familiar. Yeah, it's the things that we've been talking about, but it's with an automatic checkbox. Here I have a nice script with some thin, thick play. It's got some really thin areas. It's got some thicker areas. It would be a really good opportunity to use auto underlay. So I'm going to check that enable box. And if I want to see what it's going to do, I can click on the ellipsis, which gives me the information about the auto underlay. And here I can see the ranges. So here, the thin stuff is going to get a center walk, bigger than that, an edge walk, bigger than that, zigzag with an edge walk, and bigger than that, 2 crisscrossing fills. Sounds pretty good to me. When I hit apply, I can see that change. So here this thin area gets a center walk, the thicker area gets an edge walk. If I increase the size of this, let me zoom out. Let's increase the size of this to 1.5 inches. Here we can see that the thinner areas are getting edge walks, where the thicker areas are getting zigzags and edge walks. So it depends on the width of the element or the segment of the letter, what it's really getting, but it's adapting based on the average stitch line length. If you need a few more options for your auto underlay, you do have the ability to choose a light, medium, or heavy, and that will be a little more or a little less aggressive depending on your need. Now these are not adjustable, whereas the user defined, you can go in and tweak these values to your liking. So we've talked about all the different types of underlay and when to use them and where to find them. And I want to tell you that I had to work pretty hard to get the lettering or any embroidery element back to a point where you needed to apply a lot of those. That auto underlay is a really, really handy tool, and it happens to be on by default. So a lot of what you're creating will already have this, which is really nice. But if it doesn't, you at least know where to find the properties to make it have it.